Protests in China against the government's strict COVID measures have intensified, with some of those taking part openly calling for the country's leader, Xi Jinping, to stand down. Well, those recent demonstrations have been prompted by a deadly fire in the western region of Xinjiang last week. It's thought rescue efforts were hindered by coronavirus restrictions, a claim the authorities have rejected. Well, many demonstrators have been holding up blank banners as a mark of protest. They gathered in the streets of some of the biggest cities, including Shanghai, Wuhan and Beijing. From there, Stephen McDonnell reports.
It's not unusual to see acts of defiance in China, but this was something different. A crowd of protesters in Shanghai chanted, calling for the country's leader Xi Jinping to stand down and for the Communist Party to give up power. A fire which killed 10 residents in Xinjiang last week has prompted widespread anger in China. Zero COVID restrictions have been blamed for hampering people's escape and slowing the access for fire crews. Whether this is true or not, it sparked waves of protest in the regional capital, Urumqi. This has now spread to other cities and university campuses as spontaneous memorial services for those who died in the fire have transformed into demonstrations, calling for an end to lockdowns.
It's all too chaotic. The implementation is so messy. It's been 3 years already.
The pandemic policy is prolonging our suffering. This policy is neither sustainable nor scientific. This policy won't change unless we speak up.
People are also blaming Xi Jinping personally for not changing the zero COVID approach, which is forcing business after business to shut down.
The policy is tied to something that really hits people in their everyday lives. The question of whether or not they can get on with going to work. That's where these restrictions have really come up against the idea that it's the leadership that is forcing these policies.
Protests have been building in China all year, with people here increasingly sick of zero COVID restrictions. The government seems to have drastically underestimated popular discontent, yet for the moment has no easy way out of the zero COVID corner it's painted itself into. Officially, China's goal is to return each outbreak to zero new infections using strict stay-at-home orders, travel restrictions and mass testing. But it's been criticised for not prioritising vaccination amongst high-risk groups and not increasing hospital capacity. There's also still no stated plan to open up. Stephen McDonnell, BBC News, Beijing.
Well, let's go to Singapore and get the latest from our correspondent Suranjana Tewari. And just tell us, in terms of any protests today, what do we know?
Well, Geeta, there haven't been any reports of new protests. What we do know is that barricades have been put up in Shanghai, the financial capital, where that big demonstration was on Sunday night, the second night of protest. Now, there is a police presence there. People who have stopped to take photographs have apparently been asked to delete them. If they don't delete them, authorities have taken them away. So it is tense on the streets of China today, but we're still waiting to hear from the authorities definitively. We've also heard that there's been a bit more censorship online with regards to the protests and with the protest movement. But we're also hearing that reports that once people finish work, at the end of the workday today, we're almost getting there, there might be another congregation in some of the cities that have seen protests in the past few days.
And from what we know, and obviously information is difficult to be sure about, are people angry about the COVID restrictions mostly, or is this spreading to a wider political protest against the authorities themselves?
Yeah, there's really mixed signals, and as you say, it's very hard to get clear information. What we do know is that we've heard at the protests, people calling for President Xi Jinping to step down, that they're saying that they're sick of the COVID restrictions. And, it was all sparked by a fire in the Xinjiang region. And it is reported that the people there who died in the fire were there because of the COVID restrictions. And people seem to say that could happen to any of us as China continues to pursue that zero COVID policy. It wants to stamp out every single infections, as Stephen said in his piece as well. They want the number of infections to be zero. China today reported another record number of COVID infections, more than 40,000. And that's really adding to concerns around this strategy. Now, the authorities say that these measures are required. They're keeping China safe. And experts do agree because China has not had a mass vaccination campaign. But as you say, frustrations are clearly mounting with the way things have gone. We're 3 years into the pandemic now, and people are clearly getting very angry.
And are people wanting a wider vaccination campaign? And how is this affecting business? Because obviously, global supply chains being what they are, this matters.
Absolutely. China is the world's second largest economy. And so what happens in China impacts the global economy and therefore the rest of the world. It's also the factory of the world. It manufactures a lot, things that we use every day, Apple iPhones, Tesla cars. And when the zero COVID strategy has been adhered to very strictly, we've seen closure of factories, of manufacturing. And that has hit supply chains, as you say, but it's also affected people's ability to spend money and want to spend money, which has also impacted China's economic growth. Investors in this region, in the Asia-Pacific, are very concerned. The markets were all down across the board today. And that's not just about these protests. Political uncertainty does dampen business sentiment, but it's more about the COVID infection numbers. They think that, the investors think that if the numbers continue to rise, the authorities will continue to clamp down and implement lockdowns, and therefore manufacturing supply chains will all be affected.
Suranjana Tewari in Singapore, thank you so much. Thanks.